Welcome to Coffee Cup Enlightenment. Today I'm going to talk about a continuation of the previous video on justifications. Just highlighting a little bit more what are particular examples of justifications, so then you can become aware of them, and also noticing the very common justifications that come into place whenever you look at the conceptual self directly, and attempt to, while you're looking at it, to see if disidentification with it can occur. If you don't look at the conceptual self, then you don't receive any justifications. It's natural and normal, pretty much, for everyone to come into this world and develop a conceptual self. It just comes with the process of our current world, the way it is and the way it's been for thousands of years, with language and concepts and mind. And in some traditions, it's been known. This has been known for thousands of years, how the conceptual self is built. And in the ancient American tradition, they knew about this. So what they did is, with their children, they didn't introduce any language to the children. So I think that's why you see in some of these American Western movies, these old American Western movies, the Apache Indians and that, they're very silent, and they don't really talk much, the younger ones. And this was designed because they understood the mechanics of false self, and how it blocks deeper reality from being experienced. So yeah, they attempted to not include language in the upbringing of a child. I think it was until they were 18 years old. So that's sort of like an interesting point about how other traditions have actually recognised the conceptual self, and how it's developed, and what to do to prevent its development. But you don't need to do that. It's probably, even in that aspect, you're probably still, maybe even still going to have some sort of conceptual self developed, but probably not as much. But you don't need to go to such drastic measures to, maybe if you have children, to do that. Pretty much just the traditional conceptual reality that is common is okay to participate in, and but then maybe you could encourage self-awareness at a very young age, and this can help. There's many other ways to bring in self-awareness rather than not introducing language. Self-awareness, you can actually use language to generate self-awareness, and encourage children about self-awareness, and explain. There's many methods and simple ways children can learn about self-awareness and learn about the conceptual self, and hence not generate such a strong conceptual self when they reach teenagehood, and that. Which is very common for most people, the way their upbringing is. But what I wanted to talk about is the justification. So if you don't look at the conceptual self directly, no corresponding justifications arise. When you do begin the process of, if you want to call it, tackling this issue of recognizing the conceptual self within yourself, and witnessing it and seeing it, and seeing it as not you, seeing it as unimportant, seeing its irrelevance, its futileness, recognizing the corresponding reactivity that happens when you have a conceptual self, and you interact with other people who have conceptual selves as well, and recognizing and seeing all the dramas that happen, and also the dramas that happen within yourself, even when you're by yourself, the nudges that you experience continually throughout the day, which all come through having a conceptual self. If you didn't have a conceptual self, you wouldn't receive any nudges. And a whole different reality, which from the common reality that everyone experiences now, is experience. It's a reality that's effortless and it's neutral. For some very rare people, they go totally into no self, and they're pretty much totally incapable of generating any nudges or reactivity, and their perception of reality is totally different than everyone else. This is very rare, but for most people, you can begin the process by just seeing the false self for what it is, seeing how it's constructed out of thoughts and concepts, and then your consciousness identifies with these concepts, and they block reality. So some of the justifications is that arise, and I can sort of describe these in their emotional states, what they generate. And typical and common ones are guilt. So when you start looking at the conceptual self then generates judgments that you have a conceptual self, and these judgments you identify with, and the feeling of guilt arises. What you could do in this state, if this happens, and this is very common, is ultimately seeing that the one that actually is experiencing guilt, that's the conceptual self, not you. So if you can not mind the guilt, and see if you can look at the guilt in such a manner that you're not identifying with it, and you can see within yourself, this is the conceptual self that's actually feeling the guilt, not you. And it came from a prior judgment that the conceptual self made about itself, which you might not have seen, which then you become identified with, which then correspondingly births this guilt. If you identify with the guilt as that you are guilty, that you feel guilty about having a conceptual self, then you're identifying with the conceptual self again, and this keeps it in place. So this is a very common and necessary process we all need to go through if we want to undo the conceptual self. Some describe this as it's a tricky process, and that's why conceptual self dissolvement doesn't happen so quickly in people, because we have this next stage of conceptual self which then comes in and judges, and then you identify with the judges as you're the one that's judging, and then when that happens, the corresponding emotion is born, such as guilt, and then you identify yourself as the guilt one, the guilt person, and this is not true. It's a fact that you are incapable of being any of these states. Only a conceptual self can be these states. This is a fact. It's not a theory. It's something you eventually discover in yourself as you practice self-awareness and self-inquiry. You'll see that emotional states have nothing to do with your identity. They arise out of the conceptual self's judgments that you're not aware of, that become identified with, and then the emotion is born, and then the emotion attempts to become part of yourself as well. I know some people, when I've explained self-inquiry and they start doing it, they don't actually experience guilt. That's not a problem, an issue for them. But they experience some other common variation, which is not good enough. So the judgment, instead of creating a guilt-flavoured emotion, it births a not good enough flavoured emotion. And this not good enough, again, has nothing to do with who you are. You are incapable of not being good enough. This is a fact. The conceptual self is the one that's not good enough. And so if you identify with not being good enough, you're then identifying with the conceptual self again, and then this locks in place the conceptual self again. So these are the common threads that happen whenever you bring your awareness to the conceptual self and attempt to mitigate it and see if you can disidentify with it. It's natural and normal that the secondary conceptual self activity occurs. So this video that I'm talking about today is designed to bring your awareness to these secondary conceptual activities from the conceptual self, and recognize the emotional states and that arise from this further identification. It's a secondary form of identification that is occurring whenever you look at the conceptual self directly. So what some of the good ways to do this is humour is one of the fastest ways to undo the conceptual self. So if you actually not mind the guilt feeling and maybe make a joke about it, that would very much undo it, which means you're not identifying with the guilt feeling. And the reason why you don't really want to identify with these sorts of emotions, such as guilt and feeling like not good enough, is because your consciousness needs to see the innocence of what's going on. Ultimately, this is a fact, and you might not see this at the moment when I'm talking to you now, but it is a fact that all this conceptual self activity that we identify with, it's all an innocence. It's innocent. It's just it's a simple misunderstanding of our consciousness. And, you know, we live in a world where it's common and prevalent, and every language and music and entertainment is shrouded in conceptuality of this conceptual self, and encourages the conceptual self-identity. You know, song lyrics contain the words I this and I that, and if it's in a song lyric, then you can, it's so easy just to assume that that's who I am as well. I am this emotional state that's described in the song lyrics, and or you know, in movies, if you watch people's reactions in drama series and that, and there's an assumption that this is who I am as well. I am this drama reactive pattern theatrical play as well that's going on within me. So yeah, so that's the world we live in at the moment. There's much encouragement in our surroundings that reinforce the conceptual self and normalize it, and there's even institutions which has been going on for decades in the psychology industry when it comes to building a positive self-esteem. The self-esteem, the positive self-esteem, the esteem is the conceptual self. So what psychology has been doing for decades, which now it's slowly starting to recognize more how the conceptual self, what it actually is, and these sorts of methods are starting to become eradicated and singled out. But the positive self-esteem is building up the conceptual self in a positive manner, and hence calling this freedom, and it's not. It's just people have become masters of positive self-esteem, have practiced it for decades, and they have not found any freedom at all. This is not true freedom. Any conceptual self, even if it's a positive conceptual self, is conceptual self, and not who you are. If your consciousness would speak, it's saying, why are you going to all that trouble following a positive self-esteem conceptual self? I'm already here, you know. So but it can actually help some people. It's better than having a negative conceptual self. Swap over to the positive conceptual self, and also a lot of the methods to build the positive conceptual self actually generate a lot of awareness, self-awareness, and can help undo the conceptual self. So it's not necessarily a process that can be 100% singled out. It still has some relevance, but ultimately it needs to be noted that even positive self-esteem, this is a conceptual self as well, and praise and recognition can build the positive self-esteem, and condemnation then tear down the self-esteem, which is the conceptual self. So you're continually trapped in this roller coaster of praise and recognition and condemnation from others, which build you up and take you back down. And that's not freedom. Freedom is when you go beyond all of that and see that you are neither the positive self-esteem, nor you are the negative self-esteem, which are both conceptual selves. And that's what self-awareness and self-inquiry does. It takes you beyond all of it, where you just rest and be that you already are. and it's a you know, it can happen in a very staggering way for some people. It can be so self-evident that it becomes staggering that the transition of these positive and negative conceptual selves both collapse, and what's left can make people feel gobsmacked and speechless if it occurs drastically. But for most people, you don't have to have a drastic change in your dissolvement of the conceptual self. It's also worth noting the conceptual self dissolves on its own. You don't actually do nothing about it. All you need to do is see the false as false. To recognize the conceptual self as not you, and then it dissipates and dissolves. It's your identification which keeps it alive. And also recognize these justifications such as guilt, shame, embarrassment, not good enough, whatever, these sorts of negative flavoured emotions that are born. This is further conceptual self-activity, and it needs to be recognised and not identified with. So, yeah, just notice this, if you do undertake the process of observing the conceptual self directly, it is very, very common that you're going to get some sort of extra activity occurring to keep the conceptual self locked in place. And it's just, a lot of people say it in a way that's like the conceptual self's fighting back and that. I don't buy any of that strategy. The way I see it, it's just a mirror reflection of the structure that's already built. It's necessary. The structure was built in this way of a conceptual self, and if you want to undo it, the justifications are going to come to undo it. It's innocent. There's no big deal in it. There's no autonomous activity going on by conceptual self. Conceptual self doesn't even exist. It's not even real. It's just a bunch of thoughts. It has no life of its own. You are the one that's always the common denominator in this. You're the one that's always identifying and giving it life. Take that equation out, and there is no conceptual self. It never existed. It's just a dream that never happened. So yeah, look out for the secondary activity that occurs, and see if you can smile. Don't look out for any frowning and seriousness when you when the secondary conceptual self activity comes along. Talk about it with people. See if you can, and watch the language that you use. Don't say I am guilty. Just say I feel guilt within me from whatever, or I feel not good, and I feel this feeling of not good enough. Not I am not good enough. So that's another method. Don't watch the language that you use. Make sure there's no identification in the language. And as you do this, you'll experience the result of what I'm trying to convey in this video. You'll experience a lessening of the conceptual self, and effortlessness shall come into your life more and more, and your whole experience of reality changes. And it may mean that you may have to live the road less travelled. Your friends and family may still live in that realm of conceptual self-identity, and the continual repeating and refueling and recycling of this process. But that's just the way it is. Awareness is becoming aware. You might have to become a little bit of a pioneer at the start, and who knows, maybe the rest of the world will catch up. So you've got to become comfortable with that, becoming a bit of a pioneer, not minding that your friends and family and everyone that the majority of people that you see in the world aren't living the experience that you're living, and the freedom and the continual ease that's evolving within you and it being experienced. You may have to become one of the 1% and not be concerned whether the world is not following you in this journey. What's primary is whether you're awakening. Never mind the rest of the world. And if you can help people, such as do a video what I'm doing to help people, do that. But ultimately, the best transmission is your own state of being. When you have a very small conceptual self, or hardly any conceptual self, or no conceptual self, everything you do in the world becomes a message to people to see, wow, look at that guy or look at that girl, how they're reacting to the challenging situation, and they react with clear and decisiveness and ease and humour and lightheartedness and undo challenging situations like it's nothing. So that's the greatest teacher you can be, is be the change, as Gandhi said. Thank you very much. Have a good day.